Can you take us back to when your spiritual journey began, and what happened?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways I can't, because I was born and raised as an evangelical pastor's kid. So, we call it religion back then, but, spirituality has kind of always been a part of my life. But there was a transition period out of religion into more of the expanded consciousness kind of brand of spirituality. And that came in 2016, I want to say. Yeah. I had followed in my dad's footsteps up till 23 years old to be a pastor, work in church ministry and all that. But I began to have an awakening out of religion, out of the dogmatic fundamentalist belief systems of my religion. And that was a hard transition, because every single friend I had, all my family, every school I'd ever been to, everything in my life was Christian. So I was like, I don't even know anybody who doesn't believe this stuff, but I don't. And that's a problem for me. So long story short, I quit my church job as a worship pastor at the time at 23 and just said, look, I got to be true to myself. I don't believe this stuff. I don't believe in this version of God that you're selling. So I got to go find my truth. So moved back to Oklahoma and then spent 4 years or so really heavily studying Eastern philosophies, most especially Hinduism and Buddhism, and understanding, God from a non-duality perspective and an Eastern perspective, which really helped me. But it was at 27 years old, I had a kind of dramatic spiritual awakening experience where I was really going through some severe depression at that time in my life. So I had, divorced from my religion, my lifelong religion, which some of you listening know is like a complete inversion of your reality when that happens. So that can cause a lot of stuff to come up. And I also gotten divorced from my wife, who I had married as a young Christian kid, because our paths kind of went like this, So that was really painful. And then I was just alone in the Bay Area working at Google as a personal trainer. There's no time to make friends in the Bay Area because everyone's rushing 100 miles an hour through their life. So I'm like alone. Everyone in my Christian background thinks I'm a heretic now. Nobody wants to be my friend. And I was just kind of in this depression. So I was really like seeking spiritually at that time of how do I get free from this suffering and find peace? So I was listening to Eckhart Tolle at that time. Every day on my lunch break, I would go up to this balcony above my gym and just kind of kick back and relax and listen to Eckhart. And it was the one sort of period of my day where I would have true peace of mind, just listening to Eckhart and watching the clouds pass and eat my lunch. And so it was probably like 3 months or so of doing this on my lunch break. And one particular day, it just must have been the planets aligned or whatever. But I was listening to Eckhart talk about things that our ego says to us in our head. And he would sort of say a comment that the ego says to us and then laugh and chuckle at it. And the audience would laugh. And I started laughing. And he did that like 4 or 5 times. And each time he did it, I laughed harder because I was like, yeah, man, you're nailing it. That's exactly what my ego says to me every day. Things like, if only people would recognize how special I am, then I would truly be happy. I was like, oh, dude, he's nailing it. That's exactly what my mind says to me. And as I was laughing, I kind of laughed myself into a deep realization of truth. Because, laughter, comedy can be a very potent way to realize something, right? So the universe kind of snuck in non-duality through comedy in a sense. And I just had this tangible experience of oneness. And I could spend all day trying to describe what that state was like, but to summarize it, it was just evidently clear that everything in the universe is one great energy, one great consciousness, just knowing itself, just expressing itself. And it's infinite, so it does that in an infinite variety of ways, but it's still just one essence, and I am a part of that. And that essence is eternal. It's made of pure love. Just all these realizations were childlike in their simplicity. It was like I almost felt embarrassed that I had lived my whole life believing I was separate and that love was something external to me. Other people were separate from me. It's like, God, what a delusion I was living in. So I spent 2 weeks in this like blissed out state of absolute inner peace. And at the 2-week mark to the day, I always tell this story, the way that I sort of began to slip out of that state was because I woke up 2 weeks to the day, checked my phone and realized, wow, it's been 2 weeks and I've been in this total bliss for 2 full weeks. And the first ego thought came back online in that moment, and it said, wow, I wonder if I'm enlightened. And I didn't catch it, right? I just thought, oh, maybe this is enlightenment. So I went through my day, and then slowly the suffering thoughts came back in. And the belief that I was a separate entity came back in, and I felt separate from people again. And the love started to diminish and all of that. And then my depression eventually came back full swing, even worse than it was before, because it was like I sort of felt like I had been given this free sample of enlightenment, and I had messed it up somehow, and I'd been kicked out of heaven or something. And now it was even worse to suffer from that, because now I had proof, right, that an alternative exists. You can be happy, you can be free, but I lost it, and now I'm suffering again. So it was a blessing in disguise, because what it did for me was that it gave me proof, number one, that freedom's available. And number two, it gave me this burning motivation, this burning passion to abandon everything else in my life other than this one pursuit, to figure out how to get back to that state of consciousness again. And that was my life from that point. And that sort of just slowly evolved into everything I teach about today.
And that, I mean, I think it was all part of the plan to give you that taste, because without that taste, you wouldn't have the unwavering need to get back there.
You got it.
Without question. Now, you in your bio, I heard you say you had a Kundalini awakening. Now, I've heard of that term before, and I've heard about Kundalini energy, and as you can see by the artifacts and things around me, I've also studied Eastern philosophies as well, and yogic philosophy. So I've heard mixed things about Kundalini, meaning that it can be extremely dangerous if not dealt with properly. Mm-hmm. But I've heard it is also a gateway or a way to find enlightenment as well. But it is something not to be played with, lightheartedly. So can you explain first of all, what Kundalini energy is, and then explain your Kundalini awakening?
Sure. Yeah. I'll try to make this as simplistic as I can, because we can get way deep into the weeds if we want. So a Kundalini awakening is an experience that has happened in humans for thousands of years that we know. There are wall paintings of Shiva, for example, in the Indus Valley that have been found that date back 5,000 years ago, of Shiva in a meditation posture with serpents rising up all around him, kind of in an ecstatic state. And we know that the Yoga Sutras from Patanjali, for example, date back to 3,000 years ago or something like that. So this has been in literature for a long time, but it was always considered to be a very rare thing. And potentially it was, but also potentially there wasn't the internet back then, right? Where we could all be connected and realize, actually, this phenomenon is happening more than we realized around the planet. And so what it essentially is, if I had to dumb it down, is that it is sort of a neurobiological process that happens within our nervous system after a certain level of spiritual effort has been given. When we start to raise our consciousness to a certain point where we're, for example, becoming aware of oneness, we're living from a place of love and unity towards everything, it sort of puts a demand on our nervous system to upgrade itself, because our current nervous system, first of all, the nervous system is like the interface between consciousness and the body. It's like the mirror that consciousness shines itself into, and then the reflection is this human being experience I'm having, right? Mm-hmm. So when we're living selfishly and greedy from those lower three chakras, then we don't need to expand our nervous system, because that's what it's built to do very well, right? But when a new and rare state of consciousness starts to happen in us, such as love and unity, it requires a higher frequency, we might say, for the nervous system to be able to handle, because love is a very high frequency. That's why it feels so good. And why, for example, blissful experiences are very, very fleeting for the most part. Most of your listeners have probably had little glimpses of oneness or bliss, right? Where they feel unified with the creator, with creation. But classically, it kind of goes away as fast as it comes. And then you're kind of dropped back into this dense separation consciousness, right? Well, that's because bliss and love and unity is a higher vibration. So it's as if, we're kind of maxing out the RPMs on our engine, and it kind of burns out and has to go back. So how do we sustain oneness and bliss and love? We got to increase our nervous system's capacity to handle that kind of frequency. And so that's what a Kundalini awakening really is. It's that there is a dormant energy at the base of the spine that kind of is lying in wait in potential for this level of frequency to be activated in us. And when it is, this energy responds to it and begins moving up the spine, up towards the brain, and then eventually down into the gut. And it's this total transformation of our neurobiology to a higher frequency level. And so you have all these classic symptoms that people have written about for thousands of years after a Kundalini awakening, where firstly, usually we go through a dark night of the soul, where all of our traumas, our negative core beliefs, and all this stuff has to come up and be surfaced and be dealt with, because it's kind of in the way of that frequency of love, right? So people sometimes go through a psychotic meltdown after a Kundalini awakening if they particularly have a lot of traumas they haven't healed yet. But after that period is over, we classically will start to experience this incredible open-heartedness where we just feel so loving. Everything seems to sparkle. These are classic Kundalini awakening symptoms. And that's because your frequency has picked up now, and this new energy is flowing through your nervous system.